I probably should introduce myself first. That's probably the best thing. So I'm David Smith. I'm a writer. I write for the website Summer Fruit Cup. I also do quite a lot of work with craft distillers, both in the UK and the American Distilling Institute in the US. I have a book as well on the craft of gin, so all focusing on craft gin. And I've just last month I was out in Seattle with various craft distillers, up to various tricks and things. And one of the things that interests me, as we were talking about juniper, with what's going on in the US, is of course there are other varieties of juniper other than Juniperus communis out there. As is mentioned already, Juniperus communis you must have to be gin in the EU, although I'm intrigued as to sort of the technicalities of having some Juniperus communis in there and having some other varieties as well as a sort of additional botanical as opposed to actually the juniper in there. And we did play around with sourcing some other types of juniper. One was Juniperus occidentalis and one was Juniperus, I can't think what I think it's Virginius or something like that, I think it is. And the occidentalis was all right, quite citrusy. The other one wasn't quite so great, and I think it's a diuretic as well, so it's not. Although I don't think it should cause too much problem if it's distilled over, is my understanding. But it was interesting to taste those distillates on their own, and see why generally Juniperus communis is the preferred one to use. I think they might have some benefits in addition to communis, but probably not as the main juniper in itself, aside from any EU rules anyway. And the other interesting thing that I thought of was that there is a gin in Scotland called Crossbill that sources their juniper 100% from Scotland, and rose hips, two botanicals. It's rose hips and juniper, and it's 100% sourced from Scotland. But I think it took them a long time to get the source, and they sort of had to cultivate it to sort of get it up there. And I think that's up in Argyll. Anyway, that's a little sort of little bonus thing. So we'll start because everyone's got their gin now, right? Yeah, that's good. That's good. When I walked over from Waterloo, I was hoping, because I got in time for the tea, that there might have been a gin tonic, but alas, no, I had to deal with water. But never mind. So the purpose of these two tastings I'm doing is just to take you through a few gins that, first of all, I think are good quality, but also that are kind of interesting and they illustrate different points. So the first one we've got here is Origin, which is this one here, and this is made by Master of Malt, and their distillery is sort of Tunbridge Wells, and it's bottled at 46 ABV. And the project, this actually came from when they made their bathtub gin, and Ben, who was not distiller because bathtub is a compounded gin, but when he was making it between batches, he was noticing that the quality of the juniper, not just the quality, but the flavours that he was getting with the juniper was changing. And so he set, using Twitter and all that, a bounty. I think it was £100 if you could find somewhere which was effectively like 100 square mile area where you could guarantee that, and it was a certain amount of juniper that he needed, you could guarantee that it came from that area. And they've done 6 or 7, I think. There's Albania. This one is Bulgaria, which is one I particularly quite like. And so what you've got here is just juniper distillate. And you can, when the product comes with this little vial to add botanicals to it, but to my mind, I thought it was more interesting just to taste just straight juniper on its own. And also, so it's a grain base, neutral grain base, and it is cold distilled as well. So you've got a few different things in here. So I suggest we have a little taste. And for me, what I find interesting about the project that they've done is actually the variety and the depth of flavour that can come just from juniper. It's not just piney or resinous or things like that. There are some citrusy elements. I get some citrusy elements in there. Yeah. And what do people think of this? And their sort of thoughts? General sort of nodding. But, can you see the sort of complexity in that? Is it surprisingly complex, or do you think it would have been more complex, or?
It's interesting to trace the gin with just one botanical.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's a question I should have asked you about, John, which was about numbers of botanicals, because obviously there's such a great variety from theoretically something like this, which only has one, up to I don't know. I think Monkey 47 has quite. I'm not sure if it is actually 47 in there, but they're up that end with quite a few botanicals, and I find the being a bit choosier about what botanicals you've got. There's some very interesting things that can be done with the very low numbers of botanicals: 2 botanicals, 3 botanicals, 4 botanicals. Although it sort of seems to be between about 8 and 12 seems to be about the sweet spot for most people, but. And this is from Veliki Preslav, which is northeast of Bulgaria, just so you get an idea of that. But all of the junipers that they did in their range, they all sort of came from that Baltic region, Italy and things like that. There was one from the Netherlands, which I believe was a cultivated one, but that's about it. There was not a. They generally were from one particular area. So. But an interesting point to note with this is that even though there are and the different spirits do taste quite different, even though they are, even within this 100 square mile, you could imagine that there'd be variations even within that area, because is it is it in the shade or things like that? The conditions that is in within that locale are going to make a lot of difference as well, which I think is something that Desmond had, when we discussed it before, something that you mentioned is important, where the stuff's being picked from as opposed to just the locale. It's sort of the conditions it's in as well, and the quality and things like that. So there's many variants with juniper, but I think it's quite interesting to be able to just taste one thing on its own. And I think that you can get these little dram samples of their juniper. So that's kind of interesting. One question I had for people is, who here is making gin at the moment? Okay, and who's here because they want to make gin? It's a question I often ask us. There's quite a few sort of what I would call aspiring distillers. I don't know. I think that's not a negative term, is it? Aspiring distillers? I think it's nice enough. And who's here just because they like gin? Excellent. Very good. Right. So. So we're waiting for if we have the next one, please. That would be lovely. I think we've got to pick these pieces up, and then we can go from there. There's one. I mean, it just sort of shows how different things are in the US when you don't have the rules of the EU to come down upon you. That there's one distillery in Lyons, which is sort of. It's a little bit north of Denver in Colorado. It's right up in the mountains, and I think they're back on track now because when they had the floods in Colorado, they were pretty much flooded out. But and we rolled up there, and we were trying to find it. We weren't quite sure it was, but we just saw this huge sign off this road where it just said distillery, and we thought, even if that's not the place we're going to stop in. And we arrived, and there was the distiller out in the car park with a blowtorch, like a acetylene torch, making another still that because he's built all his own stills and things like that. They have a bar attached to them as well, and he's never purchased or foraged for his own juniper. He gets people in the local area, if they bring in a Ziploc bag of juniper, then they'll get free drink in the bar, and that's how he gets his juniper. Now, I imagine he's got to have. He has a very small still, and he doesn't make a huge amount of. I mean, it's like 5 litre sort of thing. It's quite small, but I imagine you'd have to do a lot of sorting to even pick up anything of quality, because people are just just bringing it in. But I think that it's a part of that is probably engaging in the local community, and because there's a lot of juniper that grows wild around there because it's sort of in the Rocky Mountains. So, and I think part of it is just to get people in, and they come for their one free drink, but maybe they'll stay for a few more. But I just thought it's a story that fascinated me, and I thought it was a different take on things. And even though it might not, and actually I think the gin is very nice, although I don't know how consistent it is. I thought it was a good example of how you can be innovative with engaging with your local area around your distillery, getting people in, and people will talk about it, and there's a sort of a feeling, well, I've got something to do with this gin. So that is the origin. So we should move on now. If everyone's got their gin, yeah, everyone got it, good. On to the Sipsmith VJOP. So I think this was released. This is the version for this is the black label. This is for the British market. It's on trade pretty much, I think. There were two varieties beforehand which had a sort of purpley label, which were for the Japanese market. The first one was a little bit higher than the normal one with extra juniper, and then the next one was even more than that, and this one is even stronger with even more juniper in it. The VJOP stands for Very Juniper Overproof, and the ABV is 57.7%. It has the same botanical mix as Sipsmith, so that's juniper, coriander, angelica, orris, orange and lemon, licorice, almond, cassia, and cinnamon. But I believe the citrus is a little bit higher, and the juniper is much higher. But in addition to tweaking those botanicals, the juniper is in there in 3 different ways. There's a longer maceration than usual for part of the juniper. Then some of the juniper is put in straight away into the still, so it's hot distilled and coming through in the pot. And then some juniper is also put in the basket, so you get the vapor infusion. And there are different. It would be interesting to try the 3 different methods, so you could really see what the difference was that it made. But those were those 3 different types of juniper that are in there. I think pretty much all you'd need is like a vacuum distilled one, and then you pretty much have the set, wouldn't you? But so that's what they do with this one, and they have this is a barley base. So I think I need to pull my. I think with barley base, you tend to get a slightly creamier, slightly smoother, slightly sweeter. It's a characteristic. It's partly mouthfeel. It's partly flavour, although it's still a neutral spirit. But that's something that you get with this, and I think it's one of the noticeable things about using barley spirit. So when you're thinking about what NGS should I use, if you want that sort of slightly creamier, slightly sweeter, slightly smoother characteristic, it's one to potentially think about. So I mean, it's quite potent because it is 57.7, but good punchy flavour. I think the juniper really comes through, and there's quite a lot of complexity there. It's the sort of thing that to really appreciate, you want to sort of sit down and savour it a little bit more, maybe, but you get an idea of it here. And as I said, it's at the 57.7, so it puts it in that navy strength sort of category. I guess most people here know about navy strength gin, right? So, yeah, I've just been doing a bit of research on it for another book project I'm working on, and it's amazing how many more navy strengths are out now. Although I must say they don't call this a navy strength, but it's in that band. I think it's probably about, including the US, there's about 12 navy strengths now, whereas 4 or 5 years ago there was Plymouth, and that was it. And they're pretty much, they all take Plymouth's sort of view of it, of this being this 57% or the old 100 British proof 57.15 ABV is what that is. Stories about gunpowder and all that sort of stuff is interesting history. I don't know how much evidence there is, and some of it doesn't necessarily make a lot of common sense either. But the 57 is what Plymouth were making, and that's pretty much what everyone else has based their navies on. So there's some in the US which are quite out there, very heavy on coriander and things like that. There's one in Sweden that's made as well, and we've got a few in the UK. The ones I quite like, they're all British ones. Royal Dock I think is very good. I like the Plymouth one very much, and I like this one as well. So what do people think of this one? Too potent to drink on its own?
Very peppery and spicy.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a characteristic I quite like in gin. I mean, everyone's got their personal preference, but it's kind of the thing I quite like. I think it can work really nicely in. I like that sort of style of gin and at that ABV in gin and tonics and martinis. But it's a case of you wouldn't have a very big one and you wouldn't have very many. But I'd rather have a well-made sort of. Generally, if I drink martinis at home, I go for the sort of 1950s style or 30s or 40s style glass, which is. Oh, I don't know, it's probably 40 ml or something like that. It's like those very, very small ones. I'd rather have one of those and have tried a few different gins or something like that than have a bucket-sized martini or something like that. Although I believe if you're doing a cocktail party, the large martini glass is the one that you would start with, and then you move on to the smaller ones. Something to do with people will drink very quickly when they arrive, and it won't get too warm, things like that. But so we are on number 3 now. One of the things that interests me about things like navy gins and aged gins and things like that is it's kind of one of those products which is, once a distiller's got their main gin done, that's kind of the thing that they start to sort of look at. There's the sort of a secondary tier of different sorts of gins that can be played around with, which will typically be in a more limited quantity and probably a bit more expensive as well. I mean, if you've got high ABV like that, it's going to be more expensive, but it's one of those interesting things. So what we've got, thank you very much. What we've got coming around now is, Gilpins. So I should say, so the first two that we had, they're distilled in-house, so they're not distilled by anyone else. The people that own the brand, they distill it. Gilpins is made at Thames Distillers, so it's probably what I would describe as a third-party distilled gin. Not that is by any means a bad thing. So this has been out, I think it's about 3 years it's been out, but it's recently done very well, winning some awards and things like that. Yes, so as I said, it's made down at Thames. It's a wheat base. And so I suppose, I'm coming from most of these things from a flavour point of view, because that's more of my background. But certainly from when I've tried sort of wheat gins with a wheat base, it tends to give a slightly cleaner, slightly blanker canvas to display the botanical flavours on. That would be my sort of interpretation. And the same with things like the Sipsmith barley. If you went for a malted barley, there's one in Scotland that uses malted barley, very common in the US. That you, rather than sort of painting on a white canvas, you're painting on a sort of beige canvas, because a lot of that character's coming through. Has some slight sort of white whiskey notes coming through, some breadiness and fennel, if you use malted barley. But back to this. So this is wheat. It's 47%, so I think you can guess I quite like strong gin. But mostly because the flavour comes through more. And I think it's the worst thing with gin is to have, you taste it and you just think, oh, it's just so limp. It doesn't have any vibrance in the botanical flavours. So this has some very classic botanicals: juniper, coriander, angelica, and lemon and orange. Also has lime as well, so quite a lot of citrus in there. Lime definitely becoming more and more popular in the UK, but also very popular in the US. And then it's got sage, and then one of the more unusual botanicals, borage. Does anyone know what borage is? Borage, yeah. So it's a herb basically. Little purple flowers, and then the leaves are rather like cucumber. I think it probably was the original garnish for Pimm's. It was borage leaves and lemon, but it's a lot easier to get cucumber, and so I think that's why things are sort of slightly to go over. So I think this is a nice example of a gin that is pretty in the middle in terms of its character. Yes, there's juniper there. Yes, it's quite dry. Some of the sage and the borage, they add a little crispness, some little herbal notes towards, sort of a little bit later on. But it's not really in that camp. They also, although it's distilled at Thames, the water comes from the Holywell Spring in the Lake District. So they have a specific water supply that they come and they put into this gin. It's to me, the jury's out on water source and how much of a difference it makes. So I'll just be very frank with you. I'm not. I think particularly if you're distilling the water anyway, or doing certain types of treatment to it, then a lot of that character is going to be lost. But some people do make a big thing about the water that they use. Martin Miller's is an example of getting it from Iceland and things like that, and iceberg gin from Canada melts icebergs, I believe, to put in their gin. Although I am assured that they are icebergs that would have melted anyway. Sipsmith, they get their water source from the source of the Thames, so not just sort of tossing a bucket into the Thames and off Waterloo Bridge and pulling it up. There are a few examples, and there are some other gins that we'll taste today that use their own water source, and they very much feel that it makes a difference. And it's generally when they're talking about this water source, it's what you're cutting the alcohol with, of course. So depending on the ABV, it can make up a fair portion of it, of what's in the bottle. But I've yet to do an experiment to try a variety of different waters to see if it makes any difference or not. It does make a nice marketing aspect to it. If you say, as we've got 2 gins later on, the water comes from the land in which the distillery sits, and so it's quite a nice story, and it can sort of engage that aspect of it. But I don't know how much it really makes a difference. As long as the main thing is to have a nice pure water source. And if you're buying in your spirit, that's not going to be made with your water source, and so there's also that aspect as well. And your tonic water's not going to be made with that water source, and maybe not the ice unless you sort of have the ice at the distillery, which people do. I've seen people do that. So we're on to lovely. Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you. I'd spoken a little bit about how quite often when you have a higher ABV for your gin, the botanical intensity is a bit stronger, and as I said, as a personal preference, that's the sort of thing that I quite like. But there is another way of increasing the botanical intensity, and not only is that, do I think it makes it more flavoursome when you're sipping it neat, but also it means it stands up to mixing better. I mean, that's the other thing about having a decent intensity in your flavour. So this is Two Birds, which is made in Market Harborough. They do there's a London dry Two Birds, and this is the specialty cocktail gin. So give you something a little bit different. It is distilled with grain. It's made by Union Distillers in Market Harborough, and the story behind this was to create a gin that could be mixed, but you wouldn't lose the underlying characteristics of the gin. So you could mix it in punches and things like that. I mean, the regular gin, Martini, Negroni, gin and tonic, Tom Collins, great. You can taste the gin, and it all comes through quite nicely. But if you start to mix it with apple juice or more sweeter things, get some grenadine in, I don't know, or any sort of punch and fruit juices, I find generally it tends to take some of the characteristics away. It varies on gin to gin. I'm always surprised at how well gins stand up in a Negroni. I mean, you think how powerful the flavour of Campari is, but for me, to get the measure of a gin, it's a must now. It never used to be. I used to hate Campari, but but it is a must because so much comes through. And so that was what this was designed for, was so that you could mix it more easily, but without increasing the ABV. And when I heard that, I thought, not sure how well that's going to work, but let's have a taste. And so this has juniper, coriander, citrus, orris, and mystery botanical, which is there we go. So although we're tasting this neat, it's typically designed for mixing, but I think it's quite nice on its own anyway. But it is a very bold, very bold flavour, and the intensity is there just by upping the level of botanicals. That's essentially where that's come from. And they use for both methods they use a one shot. So upping that level means that. If you're not doing a one-shot, that's a little bit of a harder thing to sort of play around with. But when you're doing the one-shot, they've effectively just increased the number of botanicals that they put in the still. So, it's 40% ABV. But I think the flavours carry as if it was a sort of 45 or something. And I've played around with it, mixing, and it does stand up as well as a sort of 45 or a 47 or something like that. So, is everyone familiar with sort of one-shot and multi-shot sort of? Do I need to explain that? Oh, shall I explain it? Yeah. Okay. Right. So essentially, one shot. Let's for argument's sake, let's just assume we've got copper pot still, and we've not got a basket or anything. Just nice and simple. So with a one shot, you've got your spirit in the still. You put your botanicals in the still. You distill it, and then you would then just cut it with the water. Cut it with water to the bottling strength. So if it's coming off at 80 and you want it at 40, you just cut it half and half with water, and that's it, and it's ready to go. It's how Sipsmiths make it. It's how Two Birds makes it. There are other ones as well. With the multiple shot, you would, if say you were doing a 2-shot system, or a 3-shot or a 4-shot, but let's just say 2-shot for the example, you would put in twice as many botanicals for your 1-shot. You'd distill it, and then what you get at the end, you would then mix that with your neutral grain spirit again, or your neutral spirit, whatever you're using to start with, and then you'd bottle it. And that can go up to, it can go from, I think, up to sort of 12, I think is where a few of them lie. It can go a little bit higher than that, but it's somewhere in that sort of continuum. Some of the distillers in the US are doing like 2/3 shot sort of thing, so they don't quite put in twice as much, but they put in a little bit more. And it was fascinating speaking to them a couple of months ago, because distillers were coming up to me and saying, we're doing this really innovative, really different thing. We're blending back neutral grain spirit with our gin before we proof it with water and bottle it. And I thought, yeah, but that's pretty much what everyone does in the UK. It's not a new thing at all. It's a more efficient use of still. It's one of the things. And again, whether it makes a lot of difference on the flavour, I think the jury's out. From what I've heard from people, it doesn't make a huge difference. And certainly, am I right in thinking you cannot chemically, you can't, it doesn't show up chemically anyway. Is that right? No. So, a lot of people have spent a lot of time looking at it, and I don't think it necessarily makes a lot of difference. But that's does that make sense? Is the difference of using a one-shot method to a concentrate? Yeah? Good. That's good. So this is a bit of a different thing. What I really like about this is it's innovative. No one else has done it before, not in this way, and it just shows that if you want, when you're developing a gin, if you want to have a bit more flavour intensity, it's not just about necessarily upping the ABV. You can play around with the botanicals. If you put too many botanicals in, though, that can have a flip side, and that tends to be when you get your gin will be a lot more oily. And some gins, I don't know if anyone's ever had it when they've been tasting a gin, especially if you've added a drop of water to it, it louches, and that's kind of where that's coming from, these oils coming through. Some even do it when you put it in a gin tonic. Although, to me, if it tastes all right, it doesn't. I'm not too bothered with it, but some people have a problem with the aesthetics. So, what are people's thoughts on that one? As a too floral. Yeah, it's a strong flavour. So, Yeah, it's a strong flavour, and so I think if you had it in a gin and tonic and things like that, it would. I think you could, or even like more in a more heavily mixed thing. But you can see how it could sort of come through.
How does the cocktail version differ to the original?
The difference is in the number, effectively the amount of botanicals that are put in the still. That's effectively what the difference is between the two. In terms of the flavour profile, I think, from what I can recall, the coriander comes through a little bit more on this, which would be where probably some of the floral notes comes from. And it's just generally more intense. Sort of tasting the two together, some I prefer in some drinks and some I prefer in others. It sort of depends on what you're doing. The London Dry is your regular, everyday gin. The cocktail one is more, and that's why it was more aimed towards bars for more of the sort of cocktails that they would do, so that it would stand up without having to use a high ABV, a high strength gin. So, did they? Ah, interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Chris was just saying that there's something I didn't know, some historical precedent for the cocktail gins. It used to be something that was done a bit more, including at Burroughs Distillery. So it's an interesting one. And so, yeah. And also thank you very much. We did a craft gin awards last year, and I didn't mention, but Two Birds, their London Dry, won. It was a tasting that we did at the Ginstitute. It was a sort of competition thing, and every single craft gin that was made in the UK at the time was tasted, and there was 18 at the time. Done at the Ginstitute, done by candlelight, indeed, which is very romantic. And Two Birds, the London Dry, they won best gin. We had 3 medals. There was a gold, silver, and a bronze, and that was it. And there was about 9 of us that all tasted blind, and we tasted it with tonic as well. And I'd given it like 4 hours to do it, which was not a very smart move, because it's not enough time to taste 18 gins on their own and with tonic water, and write notes, because everyone was sent notes from the tasting as well. All the distillers were sent notes from the tasting. But well done to them for that. And that was sort of before they'd even launched, so it's quite a nice thing. This year we've changed it slightly. We're doing Gin of the Year this year. This is a slightly different thing, which I can announce here for the first time. There you go. Anyway, back to the gin. So we've got some great British stuff here. We're nipping over to the US and then to the Pacific coast of the US for Big Gin, which is this gin here. So this is made in Ballard, which is a little bit north of Seattle. I just thought it was part of Seattle, but I'm told no. So, emphatically, no, it's not just part of. Seattle's definitely a hive of distilling at the moment, as is Washington as well. But someone is going to be talking about the movement in craft distilling movement in the US later, so won't talk about it too much. There's definitely quite a few out there. This uses corn as a neutral grain spirit. Very common in the US to use corn as a neutral grain, whereas in the UK it seems to either be certainly from sort of anecdotally, seems to either be a blend of grains, or wheat seems to be a very common one as well. But in I guess it just sort of depends on what grows where you are. So they use corn. It was interesting speaking to them about craft, because they're a little independent distillery, but in Washington State they have some funny rules about whether you call yourself craft or not. And one of the rules was that if you want to call yourself a craft distillery, you have to have something like 60 to 70% of what's in the bottle has to come from the state of Washington, which means that as no one makes NGS in Washington State, you can't use NGS to be a craft gin under the rules of Washington State in the US. So that's why you see a lot of people who make their own spirit. I mean, there's whiskies and things made there as well, so that makes a difference. But you see a lot of people doing that. But that's just one state. It's Washington. But one of the downsides of not being a craft distillery is you couldn't pour at your distillery. Although that has now changed, and if you're just a normal distillery, you can pour, and so people can taste. And you can buy straight from the distillery in Washington, and you don't pay any tax if you buy straight from the distillery, which I think is quite a nice. Yeah, given I can't, it's something I was trying to think. It's the state tax in Washington is something like, because they've recently changed from having the monopoly to sort of they do a different sort of system. Something like $2 plus 20% is the duty on it. So if you buy it straight from the distillery, you don't pay that. So needless to say, most of the distilleries do quite a good trade of selling their products, and much cheaper. I think this is something like $30 or something like that. So it's quite because they don't have to do that. So in terms of botanicals, we have juniper, coriander, angelica, bitter orange, grains of paradise, cassia, cardamom, orris, and the slightly unusual one is Tasmanian pepperberry, which, from having tried it, is not dissimilar to grains of paradise in terms of its flavour. There's a slight variation, but if you've ever bitten into a grains of paradise, not the thing to do before a tasting, but that sort of menthol pepper notes are in there. And I think that when you taste this, that's what comes through at the end, is that menthol pepper notes. I also think you get, I'm getting citrus and cardamom on the nose, quite a lot of citrus up front, and then you sort of have your slightly more, like those more sort of juniper angelica sort of notes, then your citrus, and then that menthol towards the end. And this is bottled at 47% ABV, and they also make they call it a barreled gin, so a gin that's been put in barrels. I think they're Heaven Hill cast, I think, and I believe they don't even wash them out before they just get the barrel and pour the gin in there. So the aged one is a sort of combination of both gin and with a little bit of bourbon in it, I think. So yeah, and as I said, it's Seattle. It's certainly a very booming movement with the gin and that. And when I went and visited them, I was intrigued that they have a swing in their distillery, which is kind of an odd one. I don't know if anyone else has a swing in their distillery, but literally comes where the still is. It's sort of just comes down, and their daughter they have like a 3-year-old daughter, and she can just sit in this swing whilst they're distilling. So they sort of have, like some distilleries have like a distillery dog or something like that. They have a distillery cellar. She's there, she's there, which is great. So seems to enjoy it, and there you go. They also have partnered up with a tonic syrup. Has anyone ever tried tonic syrup? Because I know it's a few people. It's a big thing in the US because they don't have like we have Fever Tree and we have Fentimans and we have Peter Spantons and other sort of where they'll bottle they bottle it and they carbonate it for you. There's a lot less out there. It's really Q from Brooklyn are one of the only people that do it. But this syrup is very common for people to use, and it's I think it's a very sort of cottage industry. People are just putting quinine and their citrus and whatever it is and mixing it up, and you get this sort of sticky brown syrup, and that's you then mix that with club soda or soda water or whatever, and that makes your tonic water, and you can add your gin with it. And there's a few gins that have started to make their own tonic syrup to go specifically with their gins, which is kind of an interesting concept. Of course, 6 o'clock, Bramley Engage, they do a carbonated tonic water to go specifically with their gin. The tonic syrup. I'm very intrigued by the how to get the levels right and things like that with quinine, because there's got to be a lot of question marks over what you're using and you're putting in there. Even like quinine now seems to be a bit difficult to get hold of in this country at all. But that's a sort of a side point. But that seems to be the big thing in the tonic aspect of it. And as I said, more and more, there's no sort of barrier to entry to making tonic syrup. Really, you just buy the ingredients and you make it on the stove and you bottle it. Seems that's how in the US at least. So more and more people are sort of looking at that. So. Also, the other thing about this one is I think although you've got some very classic elements to it, you've also got a little bit more of some of the spice coming through, and a bit more of the citrus. So it's a little bit more what I would call contemporary. That tends to be, I mean, you can use whatever terminology you like. That tends to be what I use, is this sort of idea of classic versus contemporary. And contemporary includes things like New Western Gin and New American Gin and things like that. Having spoken to a variety of American distillers, they can't seem to agree on one term. The people on the East Coast don't like New Western Gin because, well, that's only for gin made on the Pacific, and you have all these sort of variations. So for ease of communication when I'm writing and talking about gin, I use this sort of classic and contemporary. But for me, Big Gin kind of sits in the middle, a bit like Junipero, which I guess many people will have had Junipero, which was described to me by a chap from, well, he was at Berry Brothers and now he's at Anchor, as a London dry gin, went to California, got a suntan, and did some bench presses, and got a six-pack. That was how he described it. So it was this idea, this hybrid almost of the classic English style of gin, or this classic style, juniper forward, coriander and citrus and things like that, where, as opposed to these other ones, where some of the other juniper's definitely still there. Obviously, it has to be there, but some of these other elements are coming up as well. And so I sort of coined the term the Cary Grant Gin, or the transatlantic gin. I was told mid-Atlantic is off because that has other connotations in the US. But the transatlantic sort of style, with 1 foot in the classic England and 1 foot in America, and that's kind of sort of my descriptor of it. And I was amazed when someone who hadn't read anything that I'd written on it came up with the same idea to me at a distillery when I was out in the US, and I think they called it the Katharine Hepburn gin. I was like, well, it's the Cary Grant gin, it's the same thing, and it's this sort of this hybrid between the two. It's certainly it's a direction that is interesting, I think, and it's going to become more and more of it's not so much an issue, but it's something that's going to be discussed more and more, I think, and I think more and more as craft comes out, because you have excellent jobs done by very big, by the more established gin houses, your Tanquerays and Gordons, Beefeaters and things like that. Craft distilleries can't compete with them on that point, and they fill different spaces. So I think that's part of the reason why a lot of craft distillers feel the desire to move to a slightly different sort of angle so that they can differentiate themselves. And I think with that comes a shift slightly more over from the really, really classic stuff to some of the slightly more, the greater variations. And that's certainly something that we saw last year when we tasted all the craft gins of the UK. And it's the same things happening in Europe as well. Herbal gin seems to be quite common, quite popular in Europe. I guess it's partly to do with the tradition of herbal liqueurs and things like that, but you can have some really nice, there's certainly the Duke, which is from Munich as an example. That's a very nice herbal gin out from there, and make really nice Negronis and other drinks as well. But what do people think of Big? Because I know we're moving slightly outside of the traditional comfort zone, but do people find it too out there?
Too much cardamom, I'd say.
Too much cardamom.
It's getting a bit too perfumey for my taste.
Too much cardamom,
It's
yeah.
got a bitterness in it as
It's
well.
a bit peppery. So
Yeah, I think with those two peppers as well, and they're pretty pungent. Pretty pungent to have it in there as well. Yeah, I think cardamom is a funny one. I think it's one of those. Some people really like it, and they can just sort of lap it up, and other people can't. I was sitting on a judging panel once. I won't say which one, and I won't say who it was, but their criticism pretty much of everything was it had too much cardamom in it. It was just like too much cardamom in this, too much cardamom in that.